Okay, so Webquest Unit 1, this is my presentation. So here's the literary terms I'm going through: allusion, analogy, so on. You'll see them in the slides. So allusion is, my definition is making a reference in literature to something else without making it clear what it is. So an example that I chose was from Greasy Lake by T.C. Boyle. The author described what the boy found in the lake beneath the surface, but does not say outright what it is. It was described as something unspeakable, obscene, something soft, wet. I reached out to touch it. It gave like a rubber duck, it gave like flesh. So obviously the author alludes to the fact that the thing in the water is a dead body. The next one, analogy, comparing something to something else that is different yet familiar. Where Have You Gone? My example is Where Have You Gone? Charming Billy by Tim O'Brien. In the very first sentence of the story, he compares the soldiers walking in a straight line to sheep. He said the platoon of 26 soldiers move slowly in the dark, single file, one by one, and they're like sheep in a dream. So he's just comparing them to sheep. Direct characterization, showing the personality of a character in a story through phrases. So I chose Greasy Lake again for this one because he boiled directly phrases, uses direct phrases to introduce the three boys in the story. The narrator describes themselves saying, "We were all dangerous characters then," so obviously using phrases to describe themselves. Indirect, describing the personality of a character through their actions instead of just outright saying what they are. So I chose Saboteur by Ha Jin, because Mr. Chewy is described through his actions and words more than through direct descriptions. At the beginning, he seemed like a man who was not afraid to speak against what is wrong. Mr. Chewy got to his feet and said aloud, "Comrade Police, why did you do this?" He stretched out his right foot to show the wet sandal. So obviously he's like showing his character through his actions. In media res, my description is starting the story in the middle of an ongoing plot. My example was from Where Have You Gone? Charming Billy by Tim O'Brien. The story starts out after the event when Billy died. The author uses in media res to show the depth of the story on Billy. I think the point was to have the characters reflect on it. So obviously it just starts out right in the middle from that other sentence I said where he was describing them as sheep. And this happened all after the actual event with Billy, and that gave depth to the story, starting it just in the middle of an ongoing story. So flashback, redirecting to an event that happened in the past. Obviously, I used an ounce of cure because like the whole story is basically a flashback to when the narrator was younger. Near the end of the story, the author talks about how she's older. She's grown up now. I am a grown-up woman now. Let him unbury his own catastrophes. She's flashing back to when they were both younger. Foil, character that is exactly opposite of another character. So in Brownies by Z.Z. Packer, in the story, one of the protagonists, Daphne, who is very quiet, she, as you see down below in the quotes, Daphne hardly ever spoke. She was described as, and one of the antagonists, Arnetta, was commanding, and people listened when she talked. Arnetta was obviously the foil to Daphne in the story because they're exact differences. And Arnetta, one of the quotes describing her was, "Usually people were quiet after she spoke," so obviously she commanded respect and was the exact opposite of Daphne. Foreshadowing, giving a clue to what will happen later in the story. My example was Greasy Lake. The author describes what the boy found in the lake beneath the surface. But it does not outright say what it is. It was described as something unspeakable, obscene, and it was obviously a dead body. But it did not just say that outright. Imagery, using vivid language to describe a story in the scene. I chose Why I Lived at the P.O. because at the end, the author's use of imagery really drew me into the setting where she was at the P.O. When she's setting up her new living quarters at the P.O., she describes, the place, creating the picture, through the radio, the war news, all the sewing machines, everything. Even like her plants that were planted outside. Nemesis, something in a story that must be overcome, usually turns out for the good of the protagonist and the bad for the antagonist. So I chose Where Did God Show Me Billy Boy because Paul Berlin must overcome his fear, which is his nemesis, and his fear, he is traumatized. But what happened to Billy is scared of dying, and to overcome, he tries several different approaches, all of which fail. Personification and given non-human, human-like characteristics or attributes. My example was the Scarlet Imbus by James Hurst. The quote, "The last graveyard flowers were blooming, and their smell drifted across the cotton field and through every room of her house, speaking softly the names of our dead." And obviously flowers can't speak, so giving them human attributes. Suspense, an intense feeling portrayed to reader when waiting for an outcome. So I chose Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been by George Carol Oates. Oates intentionally makes the ending very suspenseful to add interest to the reader. Near the end of the story, the reader gets very frightened for what will happen to Connie because of that strange man who's pretending to be younger and is basically forcing him to come with her. Alright, so here are my authors. First one, John Updike. For this, I have to pull up my notes, so I don't know any other way to do this, but I haven't done here. So Updike grew up in Pennsylvania, got his inspiration from his mother. He also was big into writing poetry. In 1954, New Yorker sectioned one of his poems, later a short story and so on. And his poetry is praised for wit and precision. And one thing about him, he was always looking for new ideas. So A.P. by Updike, it was a store that he passed by, and he wondered why no one had ever made a story based in there. So that was basically connecting him new ideas in that book. His accomplishments, he had the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for Rabbit at Rest, the American Book Award for fiction, and the National Books Critics Circle Award for fiction and criticism. Next author, Alice Munro. She was born in Canada in 1993, went to university in Western Ontario, but she left 2 years earlier because she got married with her husband. And then they opened up a bookstore, and she began to write. And obviously, she was very successful, won a ton of awards. They're all listed here, but I'll just say a few. The 2013 Nobel Prize in Literature 2009, in the 2009 Man Booker International Prize, 2004 Giller Prize, Canada, and the 1998 Giller Prize. She won that twice, and then a whole bunch of other ones. Her books usually center around the main character's psychological development, and the one that we looked at, Noughts of a Cure, obviously focused on psychological development. The main character, getting through all of her problems and stuff, and her, just psychological problems. Ha Jin, he was born in Liaoning Province, China. I don't know how to say it. Grew up in the Cultural Revolution. He studied in America and decided to stay. He focused mainly on Chinese culture, and his book Salvatore obviously showed Chinese culture. And another point back, he grew up in communist China, so focused on a communist kind of character. So, and he won 1999 National Book Award for fiction, 1999 Penn Faulkner Award for fiction. Then another author, Tim O'Brien. He was born in Minnesota, which I thought was pretty cool. Austin, Minnesota. It's kind of by where I live. He fought in the Vietnam War, famous for writing about the war. Graduated from Harvard after the war. Interned as a reporter for Washington Post, so busy man. 1979 National Book Award he won. James Fenimore Cooper Prize for Best Historical Fiction. Pritzker Military Library Literature Award, and many more, obviously. And the book that we read, Where Did God Show Me Billy, obviously is historical fiction and focuses on the Vietnam War, like his other books. So James Hurst is my last one. He grew up in North Carolina, attended North Carolina State College, served in the military during World War II. He worked at a bank. He started to write. He won the Atlantic First Award and some other ones that are, and then famous for The Scarlet Imbus, which focused on human spirit, which is what most of his other books were on. So then, lastly, my favorite story was Greasy Lake by Boyle. I think the main social issue in the story is people trying to fit in with the crowd by making poor decisions and getting into some bad things. Obviously, it's just human nature to fit in. Sin drives us to do bad things during the favor of people, and I think that everyone, including me, can apply this to our life and stop trying to make stupid choices just to impress people, like doing drugs and alcohol and stuff, and get you in serious trouble, like what happened in the story. My favorite part about the story was the details and creativity that went into describing the boys when they were hiding in Greasy Lake from those guys. It really drew me into the story with every little detail, down to the sounds of animals that were around them. And I learned that imagery and describing the setting is very useful, instead of just, focusing only on the plot, the characters are saying, and all that. The setting is very useful for getting the reader to enjoy the story. So yeah, that's my presentation.